I was never the center of attention. From a young age, I felt that there was a clear hierarchy in our family. At the top was my cousin, the favorite of all the adults. He was the one everyone praised, admired, and protected. I was in the background. When we were kids, it didn't hurt so much. I didn't understand why he was allowed more than me, why my parents bought expensive gifts for his birthday, and mine was just celebrated with a modest cake, why they gave him pocket money for his whims, and I was told, if you want something, earn it yourself. I really tried to earn money. As a teenager, I already worked. I helped in the store, walked the neighbors' dogs, wrote tests for my classmates. My cousin never worked a single day. His money was always ready. His wishes were always fulfilled. I was told from childhood that this was normal. He's a boy, my mother would say. He needs more support. He has more prospects, my father would add. He should succeed. And me. I was just supposed to be a good girl. I could have put up with this if it weren't for the fact that even my own achievements were never taken seriously. Once I won a competition at school, I wrote the best essay out of hundreds of students. I came home with a diploma, hoping that my parents would be proud of me. They didn't even look at the award. And what did your cousin get? My mother asked. He became the captain of the football team. My father replied proudly. And that was it. No one even mentioned my success. At such moments, I began to realize one thing. My place in this family will always be second. I will not be noticed until I am needed, until I am convenient. And that was just the beginning. I was used to my parents not prioritizing me, but even I couldn't have imagined the lengths they would go to make that clear. I will always remember that day. I came home after a long day at work. I was working as a cashier at a supermarket, saving every cent to put towards my education. My parents had no plans to support me because a woman will find a man who will provide for her. I walked into the house and saw the whole family gathered in the living room. Something was wrong. My father was sitting in his favorite chair. My mother was nervously fiddling with a napkin. And next to her, my cousin was sitting next to me, and he was smiling. We need to talk, my mother began. I sat down opposite her, feeling my anxiety rising. You know your cousin is having a hard time right now, my father said. I nodded cautiously. Yes, I knew he had failed his studies and was now wandering around without a job. But what does that have to do with me? We've made a decision, my mother continued. He's moving in with us. I shrugged. Okay, what's the big deal? We had a big house. There was enough room for everyone. But the next words changed everything. But you have to move out for that, my father said calmly. I stared at them. What? He needs support. He needs space. And you're an adult now. You can take care of yourself. I couldn't make sense of what I was hearing. Are you serious? Are you kicking me out of my own house to put him here? My cousin didn't say a word. He just sat there, looking at me with that same smug smile. We're not kicking you out, my mother said gently. You can take a small picture. I felt my insides boil. I don't have money for housing. I'm still working. I'm still studying. My father frowned. Stop being dramatic. This is adult life. Everyone goes through this. I took a deep breath, trying to control myself. What if I say no? My father shrugged. It's not up for discussion. You have to move out by the end of the week. I looked at my cousin. He knew. He knew everything in advance and didn't say a word. He didn't care. My mother tried to take my hand. Danya, you'll be fine. You've always been strong. So he's weak? I replied sharply. He's just going through a difficult time right now. He needs support. I couldn't listen to this anymore. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. Okay, I said. I'll go. But remember this day. My parents looked at each other. You'll regret this someday. And I left, slamming the door. They didn't even stop me. I was nobody to them. But I decided that this day would be a starting point. The door to my house closed behind me, and suddenly the world that had seemed familiar had become a cold and indifferent place. I stood on the porch with my bag in my hands, not knowing where to go. My options were limited. I could have tried to go back, to plead, to argue, but I already knew it was useless. They had made their decision, and they didn't care what happened to me. I could have gone to my friends. I took out my phone and started scrolling through my contacts. But when I imagined having to explain that I had been kicked out of my own home, A sense of humiliation tightened in my throat. I took a deep breath. I decided not to talk to anyone. Alone. For the first time in my life, completely alone. I walked to my car, an old one, but still in working order. It was the only thing that truly belonged to me. I got behind the wheel, closed the door, but didn't start the engine. I just sat there, staring ahead, trying to figure out what to do next. My thoughts were racing through my head. I tried to be rational. A roof over my head was the most important thing. But renting a place to live was out of the question right now. I would only have enough money for a few nights in a cheap motel. And then what? I took out my phone and checked my bank account. The amount was pitiful. I grabbed the blanket that was lying on the back seat and pulled it over me. It was late, I didn't know what to do, and the only thing left to do was fall asleep. I tried not to cry. The night was cold. There was a dead silence all around, pressing on my ears. I never thought I would ever find myself in this situation. I was kicked out. My family just got rid of me like an old thing. I closed my eyes. This is only temporary. I'll manage. Tomorrow I'll figure out what to do next. But that night I couldn't sleep. The next morning I woke up to the sound of cars driving by. My body was numb from the uncomfortable sleep, and my mind was empty. Little did I know that this day would be the beginning of my new life. When I woke up the next morning, for a few seconds it seemed like it was just a terrible dream. But the cold of the car seat against my back and the heaviness in my chest reminded me of reality. I was homeless, penniless, and without clear plans for the future. But I couldn't afford to panic. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The first thing I had to do was find a job. Any job. I looked at job sites, wrote to Facebook groups, but all the decent positions required experience that I didn't have or any guarantees of quick income. I decided to do something different. I stopped the car at the first restaurant I came across and, pulling myself together, went inside. "Good afternoon," I said to the receptionist. "Do you have any vacancies?" The woman looked at me, then nodded. "We need waiters. Do you have experience?" "No, but I'm a fast learner." She grimaced, but eventually tossed me a form to fill out. An hour later, I was officially hired on probation. The work was hard, carrying trays of food, smiling politely at customers, putting up with rude customers. My legs ached after my first shift, but I couldn't afford the luxury of complaining. I was homeless. I worked 12-hour shifts, staying after closing to earn a little extra. During breaks, I would go out to the car where my things were still stored and eat the cheapest food I could afford. The pay was meager, but the tips helped somehow. A week passed, then 2. I realized that just surviving wasn't enough. I couldn't spend my whole life serving strangers for pennies. I started thinking about what I could do to change it. Every evening after work, when everyone else was going to rest, I would stay in my car, open my laptop, and start studying. I chose online courses in programming/business/finance, anything that could give me a chance at a better future. My eyes were burning with fatigue, but I kept going. I knew that if I stopped, I would stay where I was, and I couldn't let that happen. 3 months passed. I began to realize that I knew more than I thought. One day, a customer at a restaurant started talking about creating a website, and I accidentally joined in the conversation. "You know how to do that?" The man was surprised. "Yes," I replied, even though I had no real experience yet. He took my number, and a week later I got my first project. It was a small victory, but it was from there that my path to great success began. When I got a message from the man I told about the website, my heart sank. "Ready to get started? How much will it cost to develop?" I stared at the screen, unsure of what to say. I had never worked with clients before. I had no experience in website development other than a few test questions from my course. But saying no would have meant staying put. I typed a message. "Yes, I'm ready. Estimated cost is $500, but it depends on the details." I hit send, and it felt like the craziest thing I'd ever done. A minute later, the reply came. "Agreed. Shall we meet tomorrow to discuss the details?" I bit my lip, trying to contain my excitement. My first client. My first chance. The next day we met in a small cafe. I was nervous, but I tried to sound confident. My husband explained that he wanted a simple website for his store. I carefully wrote down all his wishes, and then said, "I will make you a prototype in a week. If you like it, we will continue." He nodded and handed me the advance payment. When I left the cafe, I felt adrenaline rushing through me. For the first time, I earned money not from serving customers in a restaurant, but from my own knowledge. This was the beginning of something new. I worked on the website at night, using every free minute between shifts. I reviewed tutorials, watched video tutorials, corrected errors. On the 7th day, I sent the finished mock-up to the client. He replied a few hours later, "That's great. Make a few edits and we can launch." I closed my eyes, feeling my throat tighten with emotion. I did it. I went from a girl who slept in a car to a person who got her first project in a new field. When I received my final payment, I realized that this was just the beginning. I was no longer going to work for someone for pennies. I started building my future. After my first successful project, everything changed. I was no longer a confused girl who was just surviving. I was a person who was building her career. I found a few more orders, first through acquaintances, then through freelance platforms. Every evening, I would come home from work, sit down at my laptop, and work until 3 in the morning. My life turned into an endless marathon between waiting shifts and writing code. But one day, I realized that I didn't want to go back to the restaurant anymore. My freelance earnings for the past month had exceeded my salary at the restaurant. I sat on the bed in my tiny room, stared at my laptop screen, and realized I don't have to serve coffee to survive anymore. The next morning, I wrote my resignation letter. When I left the restaurant for the last time, I was overwhelmed with emotions. It was scary, but it would have been even scarier to stay there forever. I started investing all my energy in my development. I bought myself a new laptop, the first expensive purchase made with my own money. I signed up for a few more courses to improve my skills. I no longer had to share a room with strangers. I rented a small apartment. When I first opened the door to my new home, my hands were shaking. I was no longer homeless. I was no longer a victim. I started living the way I wanted. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to relax. I made myself a coffee, sat on the floor, my back against the wall, and just looked at the room. It was just a rented apartment. But for me, it was freedom. I did it. And now I knew I was just getting started. When life finally started to get back on track, when I started to feel like everything I had been through wasn't in vain, the past came knocking on my door. It was an ordinary evening. I was working on a big order for a client when my phone vibrated. A name flashed on the screen that I hadn't expected to see. Mom. I froze, holding the phone in my hands. In all that time, she had never called me, written me, or asked how I was. When they threw me out of the house, she hadn't even turned around. So why was she calling now? I didn't answer. I put the phone down and tried to continue working, but my thoughts were far from the code and the order. A few minutes later, a message came in. "We want to talk. It's important." The next day, she called again. And again. Then I wrote another message. "Danya, we really need your help." I reread these words several times, feeling a cold anger rise in my chest. I remembered standing in front of the closed door, spending the night in the car, looking for a job, holding on with all my strength when no one extended a helping hand to me. And now they need me. I decided to find out what had happened. I dialed my mother's number. She picked up the phone after the first ring, as if she had been waiting for this call. "Danya," her voice sounded confused and tired. I don't know where to start." "Start with the truth," I replied coldly. She hesitated. "We have problems, big problems." I was silent, waiting for her to continue. "We have lost almost everything. Your cousin, he took out big loans, invested in a business that failed. Now we're in huge debt. And," I asked shortly, "we don't know what to do. Our house is going to be taken away soon. We thought maybe you." She didn't finish, but I didn't need to. "Can you help us?" That's what she wanted to say. I exhaled, knowing that this moment would come. But was I ready to answer in a way they didn't expect? After the call, I couldn't sleep. Memories that I tried to leave in the past were swirling in my head. I remember the night I was kicked out, how I stood on the doorstep, holding my only suitcase, how my father didn't even look at me, and my mother said coldly, "You'll do it. We believe in you." How my cousin stood in the doorway, smiling as I left, knowing that this was his house now, not mine. I remember that first night when I sat in my car, wrapped in an old sweater because it was cold in the cabin. How I would wake up to the noise of the street, from the fear that someone might approach the car or look in the window. I remembered how I tried to find a job, going from one place to another, receiving rejection after rejection. I remember the day I had only a few dollars left, standing in the supermarket, deciding whether to buy bread or a cheap can of canned goods. And now they were calling, with a request. I didn't even have to ask if they had given everything to their cousin. It was obvious. He had spent it all. He, their favorite son. The one they had given every chance in life, the one they had invested all their money in, the one they had believed in without question. He had betrayed them, and now they had come to me. They had expected me to forget, to forgive, to become for them what I had been before, submissive, convenient, always helpful. I could imagine their faces, their guilty voices, their hope that I would say, "Yes, I will help you." But this time I was different. This time the rules of the game changed. I had a choice. I could just say no to them, and they would realize they had lost me forever. Or I could do something better, something they would remember for the rest of their lives. I sat in silence, staring at the phone. They waited for my answer. I knew they were counting on my sympathy. They wanted me to show mercy. But where was their mercy when I was freezing in the car? Where was their compassion when I was sleeping in cheap motels, eating the cheapest food, working myself to exhaustion, trying to get out of the hopeless situation they had thrown me into? I decided I wouldn't rush to answer. Let them wait. Let them feel at least some of the despair I had to go through. I didn't answer them that day or the next. On the third day, they called again. I picked up the phone. "Daughter." My mother's voice was quiet, almost timid. We understand that you are angry with us, and we deserve it. But please, we don't know who to turn to anymore." "Really?" My voice was cold. "And cousin?" There was silence on the other end of the line. They didn't know what to say. He left," my father muttered. "Ran away." I almost smiled. Expectedly. "Now you understand who you entrusted your life to?" I paused. "And if he hadn't squandered your money, you wouldn't have called me, would you?" "That's not true, we're sorry." I let them make excuses a little longer. They had to understand that I was no longer their perfect daughter. I was the one who dictated the terms now. "Okay," I finally said. "We'll meet." Their voices immediately became warmer, full of hope. They thought I would agree to save them. But they didn't know that this meeting would not be what they expected. I already knew what I would do next. I already knew how to make them understand who I had become, and why now they would never have power over me again. I chose the meeting place myself. It was one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. Before, I could never afford even a cup of coffee here. But now everything had changed. I had specifically chosen a table by the large panoramic window so that I could have a good view of the city center. When they entered, I immediately noticed how much they had changed. Their clothes no longer looked expensive, their movements were uncertain, and their eyes showed fatigue. These were not the proud people who had once thrown me out of their lives so easily. "Danya." My mother rushed to hug me, but I made no move to meet her. She understood the hint and sat down. "You look successful," my father said quietly, assessing me with a careful look. "Yes," I answered, "and all this without your help." They looked at each other. "We know what we did was wrong," my mother began. "You didn't just do it wrong," I interrupted. "You knowingly gave everything to another person, leaving me with nothing. And now that you've been betrayed, you've come to me." My father sighed heavily and placed his trembling hands on the table. "We made a mistake," he said. "We understand it. We were blind." "Really?" I leaned closer. "Did you only realize it because you were at the bottom? Or because I'm the one who can pull you out of there now?" Their faces tightened. "We're just asking for help," my mother said quietly. I paused, and then I said, "Okay." Their eyes filled with hope, but on my terms. There was silence. "What do you mean?" my father asked incredulously. I looked at them and let them know that I was in control now. "If you want my help, you will sign a contract." "A contract?" My mother blinked in confusion. "Yes. I am not going to just give you money. You will work." My father looked as if he had been slapped. "You want us to work?" "Exactly," I nodded. "I have several companies that need people. But you will not get high positions. You will start at the lowest level. You yourself must prove that you can stand up for yourself now." They looked shocked. It hurt them to hear this, but I did not feel sorry. I gave them a chance, like they once did not give me. "If you do not want this," I said calmly, "you can look for other options." My mother pursed her lips. "And this the only option?" I met her gaze without any emotion. "Yes." Their faces changed. They realized that the rules of the game were no longer on their side. I was no longer the weak daughter who could be thrown away. I was the one who made the rules now. They understood that either they accepted my terms or they were left with nothing. I was not going to make exceptions for them. They had made their choice once. Now I was choosing. My parents sat in front of me, silently digesting my words. I could see the struggle going on in their minds. Their pride was fighting with their need to survive. My father clenched his jaw and my mother bit her lip. "We've worked for you all our lives," he said. "And now you're offering us this?" I slowly set my coffee cup down on the table and met his gaze. "You've worked for yourself, not for me." "That's not fair," my mother whispered. I raised my eyebrows sarcastically. "That's not fair?" "It was unfair that you kicked me out to make room for my cousin. It was unfair that I slept in your car when you had a fancy house." I paused. "And now it's not unfair. It's a choice." My father looked away, my mother sighed. I could see that they didn't want to accept this reality. They were hoping that I would just forget everything and give them another chance. But this chance wasn't supposed to be free. "This is my last option," I repeated. "Either you take it or don't come to me with requests anymore." There was a long silence. My mother looked at my father, then back at me. "We agree," she said quietly. I could see that these words were not easy for her. My father clenched his fists, but he said nothing. I took the contract folder and put it on the table. "It's all spelled out here. You sign it and you start working tomorrow." They nervously took the documents and ran their eyes over the text. I could see their fear. The fear that now they were at the bottom and I was at the top. "And don't think of this as some kind of humiliation," I added. "It's an opportunity." They nodded silently. I no longer felt pain or anger. I felt in control. This was my game, and I was winning. They signed the papers, and in that moment I realized their lives had changed forever. Now they were where I had once been, and I gave them a chance, but not on the terms they wanted. I watched my parents leave the office, their heads down. Their hands were shaking, their faces tense. They realized that from now on they could no longer live their lives as they were used to. I turned to the window and looked down. It was a sunny day outside. People were rushing about their business, not even suspecting that something much more than signing a contract had just happened in this office. This was the finale of a long story of betrayal, struggle, and restoration of justice. I was no longer the girl who could simply be thrown out into the street, left with nothing. I no longer waited for approval, asked for love, or tried to prove my worth to those who did not value me. I had created my own life. I returned to my desk and sat down calmly, feeling peace envelop me for the first time in a long time. I turned the page. The story is over. I won. I was no longer a victim. I was a victor.